Hey everyone, this is lesson 2 for Intro to Philosophy. Uh, this is following off of lesson 1, which was more of a primer, more of a presentation designed to motivate to study philosophy. I've given us some difficult problems, right? Our brains are weird things, and reality is a weird thing, and we're just trying to understand it better. We're trying to get at something worth calling knowledge. And I've promised, I've hinted that philosophy is at least a start, right? It's the reason to study philosophy is because it can help us with some of our questions there. So we did that all before talking about what is philosophy. So that's what lesson 2 is about. What is it we're going to be studying in this class? What is philosophy is really the question to be answered. So that's the point of this presentation. We're going to flesh out those ideas a little bit more. All right, so I gave you a preliminary definition in lesson 1 that philosophy is the systematic inquiry into reality. I think this is actually a pretty good definition, but it suffers from two problems. The first is that it is very broad, right? It's just the inquiry into reality. That how could it possibly be more broad? So I've kind of defined philosophy as everything. So that's certainly a problem. So part of this presentation is going to be how do we chop up everything, right? How do we make sense of that within a philosophical framework? And the second problem with this definition is that it lacks historical context, right? Not only what is philosophy, but what has it been thought of? Where did it come from? Why was this something that humans decided to do in the first place, right? So these are a couple of the things that I want to flesh out in this presentation. Okay, so one possible way we could understand what philosophy is etymologically, right? So entomology is etymology. Entomology is the study of insects. Etymology is the study of where words come from, right? What was their history? So philosophy comes from two Greek roots. Unsurprising, given philosophy's kind of rise in ancient Greece, kind of its most famous. But it comes from these two roots here, philos and sophos. Philos is the Greek root for loving. So if you think of something like hydrophilic, right, that is water loving. Philanthropic, loving of humanity. And then sophos is wisdom. So put them together, and you have philosophy is the love of wisdom. So as an activity, maybe that describes what does a person do when they love wisdom. Great. But I still think that's pretty vague, right? I think that could be a lot of different things, especially depending on what your conception of wisdom is, right? So let's go a little bit deeper here. The three perhaps greatest philosophers who ever existed, right, are some of the most famous, and rightfully so. They are Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. These are all ancient Greek philosophers, and this isn't to say that philosophy wasn't happening elsewhere. It's a particular irritation of mine, actually, that philosophy is so Western centric. There are amazing philosophical ideas happening all over the world that often sometimes predate the Greeks, especially ancient Chinese philosophy. There are amazing Arabic philosophers, but philosophy has tended to have thought of beginning in ancient Greece, and that's not strictly true. But it is where most stories about where philosophy comes from begin. So, insofar as that's the story that is told, right? It's good that you know these names, and it's not undeserved. These are incredible thinkers, really. The progenitors of philosophy, but I do want you to have that context in mind that there are lots of other amazing thinkers that predate these guys, who also had some incredible ideas of their own. All right, so Socrates, he's kind of thought of as like the father of philosophy. Socrates was a hoplite soldier in ancient Athens. So this is when Greece was made out of a bunch of different city states. Meaning like the entire city was just its whole government, It had its own territory, but that doesn't mean that it extended beyond that city. So Athens was kind of its own thing, as was Sparta, as was a whole bunch of places in the land area that is now Greece. So Socrates was a hoplite soldier. He was in the military before becoming the philosopher that we know and I hesitate to say love, because Socrates is famous for one thing, and that is being put to death for being a philosopher. Right, the trial of Socrates. He was put on trial in front of Athens because basically they found him so annoying because of what he was doing with philosophy that they put him to death. And really, if you dig into that story, he totally agreed to be put to death because he wasn't apologetic for what he was doing as a philosopher. Right. He called himself the gadfly of Athens, right? A gadfly is a biting fly. And he thought, not only should you not put me to death, you should reward me greatly for biting at Athens and forcing it to engage with these ideas that I have. So I'm not going to go too far into these, but I want to give us a sense of the historical tradition of the ancient Greeks and kind of these people who are thought of as the best embodiment of philosophy, right? What is a philosopher? Who is a philosopher when that comes to mind? For many, it's these guys, right? Plato was Socrates' student, although the historicity of Socrates is somewhat debated. Was he made up by Plato? Because Socrates didn't write down any of his own philosophy. Plato wrote down what Socrates said, allegedly. So it's unsure about that, but Plato will say that he was a student of Socrates. Plato in Greek means broad, so that was kind of Plato's name came about because he was this huge guy, right? Like beyond just being a philosopher, right? He was this enormous individual. So broad, Plato. So these are just things to help you maybe remember who these guys are, and maybe in what order. Plato. It is said that all of Western philosophy is but a footnote to Plato, that he figured everything out, and we've just been quibbling about the details since. So this is an extremely important character in the philosophical canon, and he really did come up with some of the most revolutionary and fundamental ideas that we're still grappling with today. Plato's student was Aristotle, again another incredibly well-known philosopher, known for disagreeing often with Plato, and he really did everything, right? Aristotle's works are vast, and that's only the ones that have survived to modern day, and still they are vast. His ideas are again everywhere, and my field is ethics, and Aristotelian ethics is still very much talked about, still very has a lot to offer even 2,000 years later. So really incredible thinker, and perhaps embodies best my definition that I gave you of philosophy. He did everything, right? He did biology, he did astronomy, he did philosophy, right, in all of its different flavors. And so really this guy did everything. And so insofar as philosophy is the systematic inquiry into reality, it was that's what this guy kind of did. An interesting aside is that Aristotle's student, following in this line of great thinkers, was Alexander the Great. Not necessarily a philosopher, but still incredible historical figure, and obviously, took the teachings of Aristotle far and wide. All right, so maybe we can think of philosophy as we can understand it as doing the kinds of things that these guys did, right? They, I think, embodied philosophy as well as anyone else in history. But, insofar as these are historical figures, there's a lot that we don't know. Their works are vast, and so to read them in a intro to philosophy class, we could only start to scratch the surface. So let's dig a little deeper. Maybe we can get a better idea of what philosophy is at a more kind of base layer, right, before reading the entire works of Socrates and Plato and Aristotle. Socrates didn't write, like I said. Okay. So, Aristotle had a great definition of philosophy, right? He articulated that philosophy begins in wonder. So, how whimsical. We look out into the world and we wonder about it, and, that's the core of philosophy. Um, I have it on good authority, however, from some ancient Greek scholars that wonder doesn't really capture what Aristotle meant. Um, in his modern meaning, it seems like he meant something more like this, right? Um, so we might understand philosophy instead as the things people do when they begin to uncover how completely absurd reality really is. It's more of a response to the angst that is induced within us, recognizing how small we are in the world, how big the world is, and everything that goes on in it. So again, a little less whimsical, but maybe we can start to get an idea of what is meant by philosophy and what starts it as a kind of human enterprise. Okay, um, let's dig into it a little bit more. So philosophy is chopped up into a lot of different subcategories. Uh, and so I'm just going to talk briefly about some of these. You don't need to know all of these. I'll cover the ones that I do want you to know. But just to give you a sense of the landscape, right? So there's ethics, the most important, obviously. That's why I put it first. It just happens to be the one that I study. But ethics is the study of right and wrong, good and bad, right? How do we live our lives? How should we live our lives? And how should everyone else live their lives? Really important. There's metaethics, right? So the prefix meta here means at a higher order. Um, this isn't doing ethics, right? This isn't right or wrong, good or bad. It's questioning what are we doing when we are doing ethics. And I'll give you an example to that. So it's unclear if what we're doing when we're doing ethics is trying to state a fact, right? The sky is blue. Maybe that could be asserting a fact. Is that the same kind of thing that we're doing with ethics by when we say murder is wrong? We're like stating a fact. Linguistically, it certainly seems like we are. Or are we saying something prescriptive? Not a fact, but something that we want to happen in the world. So, a statement like, shut the door. That's not a fact, right? We're saying something that we would like to be true. We are trying to influence the world around us, but it's not a fact, right? It's unclear which one we're doing in ethics, and perhaps it's unclear if we should care, right? But it is important, and we're actually going to cover a little bit of metaethics in our discussion of ethics. So stay tuned for that. There's the philosophy of mind. Philosophy of mind tries to investigate: is there a self? How do we think? It's not psychology per se, which is the physics of brains, right? It's more questioning how is it that we are a thinking thing? Are we a unified thinking thing, or are we just something who thinks it's a self, right? Really cool stuff there. There's ontology, which is the study of categorizing things. How do we put things into categories? What belongs where? And I think that'll make a little bit more sense when I talk about metaphysics here in a moment. There's epistemology. This is a big one. Epistemology is the study of knowledge. It's the study of how do we know what we know. So think about justification. Think about what qualifies as knowledge. When do you have it and when do you don't? There's feminist philosophy. Feminist philosophy is actually quite a large field, and I think it can be understood as a philosophy of oppression. What does it mean, or a philosophy of power? What does it mean to have power over another? When are those relationships problematic? And how to understand that. It's an incredibly rich literature that I think people confuse because of the word feminist, right? There's a lot of uncertainty as to what that means in a kind of like a cultural setting, but in terms of the philosophical tradition, I would say that it is a philosophy of power. There's political philosophy. how do we organize ourselves into societies? How do we organize ourselves into governments? And again, a incredibly rich and deep field of study. Some really interesting stuff there. Metaphysics. This so metaphysics is the study of what exists. Okay. So a question like does God exist would be a metaphysical question for the most part, right? It is in terms of questions of existence, and it maybe sounds a little bit boring when I put it like that, right? Like obviously, you go up and touch something, it exists, but that's not necessarily a given in philosophy, and how do we know that is kind of within the realm of metaphysics. Right, but we saw with metaethics, right? There's that prefix meta in front of it at a higher order. So that's at a higher order. Natural philosophy is also stated just physics, right? So you have metaphysics and physics. Physics is the study of, how does what exists work? I think that makes sense, right? How do the things that exist work? Whereas metaphysics is what exists. So maybe that contrast helps with the ethics and metaethics a little bit. Ethics is very, very different from metaethics, as is metaphysics from physics, otherwise known as natural philosophy. It's worth pointing out that the word something like scientist is a very recent term historically, and there used to be no distinction that mattered between a philosopher and a scientist, right? Both kinds of disciplines are engaged in a inquiry into the world. One is kind of like focused on a particular kind of question. How does what exists work? And that's natural philosophy. And science, as we think of it today, though science is not a homogeneous enterprise, became its own thing because it got so good at doing natural philosophy that we tend to think of it as something separate, where it used to be understood and happily understood to be a part of philosophy. Philosophy of science, right? There's a running theme here that if you put philosophy of in front of something, it's not necessarily the thing itself, but what are we doing when we do that thing? So philosophy of science is investigating how does science work? Does it actually get us results? Why does it get us results? What are its problems? Can we make it better? Really interesting stuff in the philosophy of science. Philosophy of religion, another really important one. This asks questions of, not what does a religious tradition look like, but what are we doing when we engage with a religious experience? What does it mean to have a religious experience? Is it worth having, right? So those are some of the questions that are found in the philosophy of religion. And arguably, I think I got into philosophy because of philosophy of religion. Just some fascinating and seemingly really important questions, right? Does God exist? It certainly seems I have a lot on the line with that question, particularly if I am of a particular religious tradition. Should I be? That seems to be a really important question, right? And so I got sucked into the philosophical rabbit hole with some of the questions in philosophy of religion, so we'll definitely be touching on that this semester. And just generally, if there is a word, right, a discipline of study, you can almost always find a philosophy of that study, right? And so really these things are everywhere. My master's thesis talked about the philosophy of medicine and the philosophy of disability. How do we understand these things? What are they supposed to do? But you can slap philosophy of in front of just about anything and be involved in a kind of inquiry that philosophy does really well. And almost always you can encounter some really interesting questions. So this is a very kind of broad look at some of the bigger camps in philosophy, but a note on that, right? These are distinctions that we made up, right? Just as you go to college, right? We have all these different majors, right? These different disciplines. We made those up, right? There's no particular reason why, HCC's different majors needed to be those particular things, right? I hope that's making sense a little bit. And I have an atom on my presentation to illustrate that, right? On the left-hand side, we see a Bohr model of the atom from Niels Bohr, right? This model of the atom makes sense to us, right? We can see where the electrons are, the protons, and the neutrons. But this is a simplification of what's actually going on to help us understand it better. On the right here, we have a more accurate model where we see a nucleus and then we have an electron cloud, right? They're not nicely and neatly in these orbitals and these orbits around like a little planet that is the nucleus. It's this really weird thing that happens where the electron cloud is where we expect the electrons to be, but really they are, they can be anywhere within that cloud at once. Yeah. We won't get into the Heisenberg uncertainty principle here because it's not important here. But hopefully that makes that helps to clarify that distinction that these philosophical subdisciplines blend into each other a lot, right? They're not these nice discrete little things that we can, ethics is completely separate from epistemology, and epistemology is completely separate from philosophy of science. They really draw on the tools and methodologies and sometimes even the subject matter that each of them use. So it's a complicated picture and they blend together a lot, but those kind of labels are where you can generally find this kind of question, right? But it's blurry. The edges are blurry. Okay. The things that you actually need to know, the various subdisciplines that I'm interested in you knowing, because we'll be looking at them in this course, we're going to be looking at ethics, right? And it's closely associated with this term morality, and so you can think of them together for the purposes of this course. And so take note of these definitions. Ethics is the study of right and wrong, good and bad, right? How you should live your life according to these criteria. What is the right thing to do? Epistemology is the study of knowledge. How do we know what we know? That's all I'll say on that for now. We'll also be looking at the philosophy of religion, which is the study of the nature of religious traditions and experience. These we've selected for the course because they are really interesting, they are very important, and they borrow a lot from each other, right? So I'll give you an example. Every religion is going to have its own ethical component, right? There is going to be some way that a religion tells you that this is the way you should live your life, right? Well, that's ethics. There's going to be an epistemology of every religion. How do we know that this religion is the right one to follow, right? How do we claim to know that this is the right way to behave, right? So for every ethical theory, right, there's an epistemology of that ethics. How do you figure that out, right? Not just what is and isn't. How do you know? So hopefully that kind of shows these blend together. They have related, interesting, relevant questions for us to study this term. So these are the ones that I want you to know. All right. So returning to that preliminary definition I gave in lesson 1, right? Again, I think this is a good definition. It is the systematic inquiry into reality. It is very broad. Philosophy is incredibly broad, and so as an intro to philosophy class, we can really only dip our toes into only a very few amount of the things that philosophy has to offer. But I present this so, one, you know all of what philosophy covers, and you can know the depth of courses of study that are available in this discipline. There are fascinating questions from the top to the bottom, and they ask all kinds of questions, tremendously important questions most of the time, right? So hopefully that gives you a better idea about what philosophy is, and so now we've got the two components that we can actually start our class. We know what philosophy is, and hopefully why we want to study it. So we'll leave it off there for now. I originally had a little bit more to cover in week 1, but I realized, you're already watching the syllabus video, you're doing the intro discussion for me as well as the normal assignments, so we're going to leave it off there, and we're going to move into next, we're going to talk about ethics. It's my bread and butter, It's what I studied, and I think, again, it's the most important. But we'll be touching on, again, a lot of these other ideas. And I do want you to let me know. If you are interested in touching on any of these subdisciplines that I mentioned, I can give you resources for them, or we can chat about that in office hours. Um, but you also kind of know what we're going to be studying and why that is important. All right. I will catch you in the next lesson. Please do let me know if you have questions. I hope that was at least a little bit interesting.